Welcome. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. My name is Jay Dyer. I have with me today Jamie Hanshaw, and we are going to be discussing some films from the probably the most famous director of all time, up there with Stanley Kubrick, would be Alfred Hitchcock. And I've written some Hitchcock film analyses, but I thought it would be appropriate to do basically an entire show directed towards his works. And he's made over 50 films, and everybody I'm sure is familiar with The Birds, Vertigo, and Psycho. But what we're going to do is a really in-depth analysis of several of the top films, because as I've watched them throughout my life, I've noticed more and more that they actually have all kinds of deep themes, everything from espionage to psychological insights, and even things esoteric and occult. And most of the films, of course, focus on the darker side, I think, of the human psyche. But what we're going to talk about is both Hitchcock and the films and how they relate to everything conspiratorial. And Jamie, I know that you had a good time watching, I think, most of these films. But I want to start it out with a quote. And this is a quote from Hitchcock. He said during the filming of North by Northwest to his friend Ernie, "Ernie, do you realize that we're doing what we're doing in this picture? The audience is like a giant organ, and you and I are playing. At one moment we play this note, and we get this reaction. And then we play that chord, and we get that reaction. Someday we won't even have to make a movie. There will be electrodes implanted in the brain. And we'll just press different buttons and they'll go, ooh, ah, and we'll frighten them and make them laugh. Won't that be wonderful?" Now that's relevant because that makes me think of Aldous Huxley. Now, Huxley, of course, was part of the Royal Society, and those in the UK who would be connected to the Tavistock Institute, which would form the basis for where the West, particularly in totality, would get the idea to do mass mind control and social engineering. So the MK Ultra program would kind of have its beginnings in the Tavistock Institute, and the psychologists and psychiatrists and so forth that would go on to do work in MK Ultra. So that relates ultimately, as we're going to see, to Hitchcock and the approach that he would take to filmmaking. And I want to remind listeners too that the first hour, of course, will be free, and then you'll have to subscribe at Jay's Analysis if you want to get the full interview and discussion. How are you, Jamie?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
Yep. So we're going to start with Notorious, and I've got some notes on Notorious, and I don't know if you do. Did you get anything on Notorious?
Yeah, we did. But before we get into that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how he's not just Alfred Hitchcock, he's Sir Alfred Hitchcock.
Right.
Been knighted, so right there is a big clue that it's not just someone who loves to make movies, making it big in the business. This is systematic invasion of the U.S. by military intelligence, British military intelligence.
Right. There was, just like with the Tavistock Institute and the Beatles and the British invasion, music-wise, we also had a film invasion around that time as well. And it was in 1980 that Queen Elizabeth knighted Sir Alfred Hitchcock.
Right. So,
along with Sir Elton John.
And Paul McCartney.
And Sir Paul McCartney, if that's the real Paul.
Right. But, so yeah, he's often called the master of suspense, and he's regarded as the greatest British filmmaker of all time.
Yes, he's also, I should mention, for Jay's Analysis listeners, the master and father of the spy film.
Right. And so, as one of the world's most influential directors, like you said, he's made over 50 films and is so prolific that you can't hardly do anything in Hollywood without having a reference to a Hitchcock movie in the past, right? So some interesting things about him is that he was raised Roman Catholic and attended a Jesuit college. So that should raise some red flags again right there.
Especially, I should add, because Malachi Martin, who's written so many books on geopolitics and the Vatican, wrote an entire treatise as a former Jesuit himself called The Jesuits, where he talks about the Marxist, communist, and what he calls Illuminist infiltration of the Jesuits, which then turned the Jesuits into a revolutionary force within the Roman Catholic Church, particularly in the 20th century, which at the time of the Second Vatican Council, called by John the 23rd, really did a Masonic revolution in the church.
Right, and so it was funny part, when he was younger, he was actually rejected from military service because of his obesity, and so then he had to turn to more clandestine spy work and things like that to be in the service. But
yeah, he was a royal engineer.
Right, I found out that one of his, or actually his first published short story was called Gas, about a woman who is sexually assaulted one night in Paris. And the twist reveals that it was just a hallucination that she was having in a dentist chair. And as we were about to see, Hitchcock was always very interested in blending sex and murder.
That's also why he had trouble with women. Gas. And that was also the reason for his large tummy. Okay, not really,
okay. But his heroines tended to be what they call icy blondes. And his mother issues come out in several movies like Psycho, North by Northwest, The Birds, Frenzy, and Notorious.
Absolutely.
And so he was actually a huge fan of kind of twisted writers like Edgar Allan Poe and H.G. Wells, who you've written a lot about.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and Wells is an interesting tie-in because Wells is a member of the Fabian Society and was the left-wing version of the British elite who wanted to establish and are working towards establishing a socialist world government, which is outlined in Outlines of the Future, or Things to Come by Wells, as well as the rest of his novels, and as well as in his book, The New World Order.
Right. And so Hitchcock was most interested in making movies that could shock and brainwash, and especially make the audience scream. And so that was a really good quote you read, that he was trying to play the audience like an organ, just like secret societies try to play the world the way they want them to.
And essentially that's what Hollywood is one big sort of secret society that manipulates and socially engineers the masses, plays them like an organ. And I should mention too that well, we're going to start with the film Notorious, but go ahead with whatever points you had.
Well, I was just going to say his movies were like almost the first to feature the classic mind control themes of disassociation, doubles, mixing violence with love, sadism, and humiliation. And he practically invented the spy thriller. And so, yeah, let's talk about Notorious, because that's a good one.
So Notorious is the 1946 film that stars Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant. And what's interesting to note here is that this is released by RKO Radio Pictures. Now, RKO Pictures was, of course, largely for a long time owned by the Rockefellers. And ultimately, what you start to notice is that the big media conglomerates, NBC, ABC, CBS, RKO, back in the day, were all sort of owned by like 4 or 5 robber barons, and these mega conglomerates were also tied into a lot of people who worked in the OSS. So that's why we're going to see interesting tie-ins to the OSS. And in fact, Cary Grant himself was a military intelligence spy. He worked for, I don't know that he worked necessarily for the OSS, but the story is, as we're going to see, that in real life, Cary Grant was involved in spying for the government and tried to out fellow actor Errol Flynn as a Nazi sympathizer.
Well, it's interesting that in Notorious, Cary Grant's character uses his sexuality to get Ingrid Bergman's character to become a spy. And she was targeted and surveilled to be recruited because her dad was a Nazi.
Exactly.
And he uses her to spy on some other Germans smuggling, like uranium powder, or they didn't really say.
Yeah, it was uranium deposits that look like sand, right?
And as one of the first intelligence sex operatives, Ingrid Bergman portrayed on film, right?
Exactly, because we're going to see that too in North by Northwest, because Eva Marie Saint's character will also be a sex operative who manipulates Cary Grant. So it should be mentioned too that the OSS was founded in 1942, and so it's never mentioned in Notorious what spy organization Cary Grant works for. We don't know who Devlin works for. He's just mentioned as a government secret agent. So with the OSS forming in 1942, there's a good chance that, given the fact he's working overseas as a handler, he's probably OSS.
Yeah, and there's even one scene where they get pulled over for drunk driving, and he just sort of hands the cop his credentials, and the cop salutes him and says, as you were, whatever. But in the movie, Bergman's character loves Grant's character, and he uses that love to get her to work for the agency, right? And then when she's successful at her mission in what they call making playmates, or the sexpionage, with the target that he gives her, he shames her for it.
Exactly right. So getting the dirt on somebody and then manipulating, that's the old trick of the handler. That's the way a lot of espionage goes down. So this is real world stuff. And in fact, if you go to Espionage History Archive, Mark Hackert has a piece that he translated on the history of Soviet espionage in NATO, where this very situation actually happened, where a Soviet spy who was called a Romeo, Cary Grant's playing a Romeo, and what a Romeo does is that he uses his good looks to, like James Bond, manipulate whoever he needs to.
And then I just thought it was interesting at the end that she almost dies trying to win his approval and his love by being a good spy for him, and it almost cost her life.
Yeah, and what's also worth noting is that the plot focuses around the rich guy, the lead. His character name escapes me at the moment, but Sebastian. They're right. He's members of a Nazi spy ring himself, and they're focused in Rio and Brazil. So this is mentioned as a place where IG Farben has a stronghold. IG Farben, of course, is the mega chemical corporation that would later become Bayer Pharmaceutical and BASF. So if you bought cassette tapes in the 80s to record things, you probably saw BASF. So you were buying Nazi paraphernalia when you bought your recording tape that was blank. I'm joking, but
well, you're riding Nazi
Mercedes,
supported
right?
rides in Disney World with Siemens and things like
Siemens,
sponsor
exactly,
Epcot,
right.
And the big Bucky
German megacorps, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it is interesting too that Brazil, these locales, this is where Nazis did go. They actually did flee to places like that, and because the Germans had already set up kind of outposts in places like that, as well as in Mexico, which most people don't know. But so, like you said, we have an interesting statement by Ingrid Bergman's character, where she says, "Oh, so now I'm a Mata Hari," and Mata Hari was a famous sex spy, even though it's kind of debated how much of a spy she actually was. She was a dancer who was executed for espionage, and she was a Dutch Frisian exotic dancer who was convicted of being a spy and executed by a firing squad in France under charges of espionage for Germany during World War I. So Mata Hari goes all the way back to 1906 or so, and it's funny that she's making that reference because again, it's right away we're looking at the dark side of what really goes on in espionage is that people are manipulated. It's not a sexy spy thriller like James Bond. It's a lot of manipulation and heartache, and that's actually what we see in this film. Is they actually start poisoning her.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like Rosemary's Baby.
They don't join up by their own free will because they feel like it'll be a cool job. They're usually blackmailed
You become an
into
asset through blackmail,
yeah.
Right? Yeah, and so we have that Rosemary's Baby Crimson Peaks type scene where she's stuck there in the mansion as being poisoned by her upper class German controllers.
Right. And that's the first movie we're talking about, but that movie also, we're going to find out that he always portrays the mother as a very negative character in the movies. Right.
Sebastian's mother is kind of his handler, whereas Cary Grant is Ingrid Bergman's handler.
Right.
So a swallow is another term for a sex operative, but I'm sure you couldn't be using sex operative back in 1946, so it had to be kind of hinted at. But so is that's the we should also mention too, this is film noir, which was of course dominant in this period with dark lighting and the focus on seedy crime stories and so forth. And I love film noir in general, but that is a good place to start. Do you have anything else on Notorious?
Not really.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about Marnie, which is a famous but less popular known Hitchcock film in the Hitchcock canon. What did you notice about Marnie? I know you noticed quite a bit.
Yeah, so I really like this one. This one had Sean Connery and Tippi Hedren, who's also in The Birds, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But Connery is always in Masonic movies like Zardoz and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
And The Man Who Would Be
King. The Man Who Would Be King. And there's actually a rumor that he turned down the role of Grand Architect in The Matrix because he didn't get it.
Really?
Yeah. But in Marnie, Hedren's character is suffering from some serious post-traumatic stress disorder and is shown in many scenes being triggered by the color red and also triggered by lightning. And the mom in the movie is another cold character and is more nurturing actually to the neighbor girl than she ever is to her own daughter Marnie. And this plays into the story at the very end. But
she's also low class and southern. And it's interesting because she begins to mingle with the equestrian upper class.
Right. And so Marnie is raised to have an extremely negative attitude towards men, which makes it impossible for her to have a normal relationship and forces her into a life of crime. And so enter Sean Connery, who's like the hero, the manly man who falls for the thief, Marnie, and forces her to marry him so he can fix her. But he finds out that he kind of bit off more than he can chew when she won't let him touch her after they're married. And she actually...
Icy cold.
Yes.
Icy cold blonde.
Yes, and she actually goes catatonic when he tries to undress her on the honeymoon, and after that she tries to kill herself.
Right. So here we have in 1964, Hitchcock's dealing with disassociation, dissociative states, multiple personalities, which we actually had seen in a film that we're not going to be dealing with called Strangers on a Train, where we have this same theme, but not something that you saw a lot in the movies back at this time.
Right. And so another interesting scene in this movie was the Old Yeller moment, which comes up a lot in Monarch Mind Control, where her favorite thing in the world, her only joy, Marnie's only joy, is her horse. And her horse gets wounded and she has to shoot it herself. And this is something that a lot of victims of Monarch Mind Control have reported, that they're given a pet to bond with because bonding with people is too painful, and then once the, that bonding has happened, they're forced to kill the pet or watch it be killed in front of them as part of their trauma torture.
But of course, Sean Connery is he's not after Marnie for innocent reasons. He actually, much like Jimmy Stewart's character in Vertigo, becomes manipulative because he wants to set her straight. Now, I mean, he does in a sense want to fix her, but he also entraps her in the marriage.
He wants to be the one that tames her, really.
Exactly.
So that's all about, putting women in their place.
Right.
Yeah. And so then at the climax of the movie Marnie, Connery takes Marnie back to her mother's house to discover the root of her neurosis. And there's a scene where she regresses into her childhood personality and starts speaking like a child, and recalls the traumatic event that fragmented her, which was her mother used to be a prostitute, and one night Marnie had to kill a John that was trying to molest her during a lightning storm and roughing up her mother. Yeah.
So here we have in 1964, Hitchcock's dealing with traumatized pedophilia and traumatization through pedophilia, the splitting of the psyche, and then even triggers.
And then it's also explained why the mother is so cold to Marnie, because she was born out of wedlock when the mother was 15, gotten pregnant by a boy who she just wanted to get his high school sweater or some, affection or something like that, and got pregnant and got left, and so that's why she kind of always hated Marnie.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that nursery rhymes come up. So at the beginning of the film, when we first see Marnie's house, the kids are singing nursery rhymes, and that's kind of foreshadowing that the problem with Marnie relates to her childhood period. And then at the end of the film, the children are singing the nursery rhymes too, and so other triggers or symbolic actions would be the 3 taps, right? So it was the knocks on the door that trigger her to freak out, along with the colors, because these are all associated with the night she was traumatized.
And the rainstorm.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that it's sort of like Psycho in the sense of there being this is a psychological film. Like the whole film is about entrapment and manipulation in much the same way, as we said, as Notorious is and Vertigo. But the fixing here, of course, is all related to the fact that Sean Connery's character is a zoologist. And so he's looking at it all from a purely naturalistic standpoint, viewing himself as the superior predator who can entrap her. Because prior to this, she's actually been, we get the impression somewhat, we think she's loose, but actually she doesn't like men at all. So she doesn't have sex with them. She just manipulates, right? She goes into these different jobs and is a con man, or con woman, I guess I should say. So she's a con woman, and it takes the superior predator, Sean Connery, to put her in her place.
I really like that scene where he's trying to read all these psychology books and Freud and different things like that, and trying to get to the bottom of her problems without even actually, giving her any therapy, and suggesting that she read these books, and she just, saying how stupid he is and how it's not going to fix anything reading all these books.
It's also insightful too that she didn't get affection from her mom, and that was part of the reason that she was so cold, the icy blonde that she was. And she would in fact be triggered by blood, right? And the blood was blood from the murder. So she actually had this memory locked away that she completely didn't recall. So what's curious to me is that just like a movie like The Manchurian Candidate, we have these public Hollywood stories about things that are connected to MK Ultra, but in the 50s and 60s, hardly anyone would have known about MK Ultra or these sorts of notions. But so here you have a movie like Manchurian Candidate that's showing you what does seem to happen with the psyche.
Well, it's interesting that this is running along parallel with the actual timeline of the program, because It was right after World War II. So Hitchcock has his finger right on the pulse of what is happening in real time.
Now, this leads me to consider the possibility that, well, do we know for sure if Hitchcock worked for intelligence? Well, we know that he worked for the Royal Engineers in World War II, and then he was later co-opted to shoot propaganda films, which I'll mention here in a little bit. But there are several intelligence connections that we could make. In other words, he's, first of all, the father of, as we said, spy films. But if he's working with Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart, both of whom were spies, as well as working with Sean Connery, right, who was working with Ian Fleming, right, who is the master Black Ops spy of all time, or one of the top spies of all time, then it's a good bet that he is. I mean, we know for a fact that Hitchcock worked for the British Ministry of Information, which was involved in propaganda in World War II. So those are, I think, pretty strong connections. And given the fact that RKO Pictures was a Rockefeller institution, that, I should mention, by the way, was taken over by Howard Hughes. And of course, Howard Hughes worked directly with the CIA for many, many years. I've written a piece on that. You can look at my piece on The Aviator and Howard Hughes for more of those connections. But that gives us a basis to consider the possibility that these aren't just movies that are being made for purely artistic means. They're also being made for the purpose of study, I think, for psychology, for mass control, things like that. Something that the Tavistock Institute would be very much interested in. So next, let's talk about Rear Window, which this will relate directly to the shifting of the culture out of, I guess, older 40s and 50s norms into things like voyeurism, which will play heavily into Hitchcock films. And not only voyeurism, but the notion of a surveillance culture and a spy culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really liked Rear Window. So this one had Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly. And Hitchcock, like you said, was known for his voyeurism fetish and
Mm-hmm.
desired to make his audience feel like a voyeur also, and to
Right.
make this sort of like a normal thing. And so in this movie, Stewart's character is recovering from a broken leg, and he's forced to spy on his neighbors for entertainment. And in this movie, we see what it's like to live in a...
Almost kind of hinting at like reality TV.
Yeah, exactly. So we see what it's like to live in a big city like New York, and how even though there are so many people, everyone is alienated from having an actual community, and it's easy to hide and easy to commit crimes and explore deviance in a metropolis.
Right.
And
Great point.
so he begins to suspect his neighbor of murdering his wife, and it turns out he was actually right in the end. But the more interesting story, I think, was the character they call Miss Lonely Heart, who he viewed the entire time attempting to find companionship in this big city, but was never compelled to reach out to her even when it appeared that she might commit suicide. And,
Well, think about this. I mean, he's sitting up there alone with nothing to do but spy on everyone. He could have invited her up.
Exactly.
And they could have hung out, even just as friends, like not necessarily as
Well, he even had the two female characters visiting him, the nurse and Grace Kelly, his girlfriend, and they saw how lonely she was too,
Right.
and nobody ever went, knock knock, hi, we're here.
They were more interested in watching to see what would happen.
Exactly.
With that.
So people as entertainment, not as human beings, right? And so they ignored her for the more interesting mystery of the murderous husband and the dead dog and stuff like that. So here again is the portrayal of how city life can alienate people from each other as if they weren't even real human beings, only passing entertainment.
Yeah, and I've made the argument in other interviews that what Hitchcock is doing is not just talking about city life, but he's actually showing where we're going to be going in the modern world. So in my Vertigo analysis, I wrote that he's giving us what the modern man's going to be. The modern man will be staring and voyeuristically into the lives of others. And in fact, there are, there's quotes where he even said that about film. Film is staring voyeuristically into someone else's story. And in other words, it's no surprise that we live in a surveillance culture with the NSA, right? And so, but I mean, he's the father of the spy film. So spy culture and the very idea that you need to or should have a popular pop spy culture comes from Hitchcock. And then, of course, later Ian Fleming with James Bond. What else do you see in Rear Window? Anything else?
Not really.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about North by Northwest, which is a fascinating... I mean, a lot more could be said, but we're going to have to pick and choose here because we don't have a million hours to talk about Hitchcock. So what I have is quite a bit, and I wanted to point out that, as I mentioned in my piece, that it's curious, I think, first of all, that the film has such a huge place for the United Nations. The United Nations kind of functions in the background of this film, and that's, again, a site that was donated. The land was donated by the Rockefellers. So this is another Rockefeller-dominated institution. The Rockefellers helped set up the League of Nations, which was a kind of a failure with World War I, and then after World War II comes the United Nations to kind of be the nascent world government. And here we have Cary Grant's character is inadvertently wrapped up in this kind of CIA plot, which he had no intention of being involved in. And he's an advertising man. And that's curious because by the end of the film, Cary Grant is kind of into the spy work that he's wrapped himself up into. And that's curious because many of the original people of the advertising world and the spy world would be the same, right? So we think of like the J. Robert Mullen advertising agency and the J. Walter Thompson and the Robert Mullen agency and so forth. These are advertising agencies that were also CIA fronts. So I would point out too that, as we said, this is rumored to be the first film to mention the term CIA. I've heard somebody say that that's technically not correct, that there's another film from the 40s called OSS that mentions the coming CIA, but I haven't seen the film OSS yet to say. But at least as far as pop film goes and known films, it's North by Northwest. And we should point out too that, as I said, Hitchcock would adapt spy tales from William Somerset Maugham, the famous author who was a MI6 agent, which a lot of people don't know. And his novel Ashendon would become Hitchcock's 1936 film Secret Agent. Hitchcock would also take Joseph Conrad's famous book, The Secret Agent, and make it into Sabotage in 1936 as well. And of course, Joseph Conrad is connected to also connected to British intelligence type storylines. Now, other famous espionage films that everybody should see from Hitchcock would be 39 Steps, as we said, Notorious, Torn Curtain with Paul Newman, that's a Cold War spy story, and The Man Who Knew Too Much, which we will mention in passing soon. But I think it gets even deeper because, as we said, there's connections to the Tavistock Institute, which you're going to talk about here in a little bit with the article from the EIR and Alexander Korda and his circles. And this is where British intelligence would be directly connected to British filmmaking, and that would then influence American filmmaking. But again, I don't want to take too much of what you're going to talk about. Well, that was in that article.
That was really good.
Right. So, well, I'll go ahead and read this quote. I think his name is Mendocino. He says, the Korda's task was to develop a pro-British current in American pop culture. They hired Aldous Huxley to write screenplays for 2 hit Star Wars style fantasy pictures of the 30s, Kipling's Jungle Book and The Thief of Baghdad, in the process of making Huxley's name as a scenarist. When the Kordas stayed in Hollywood, they usually housed with one of the British clique, which included Huxley, composer Igor Stravinsky, and Tavistock psychologist Humphrey Osmond. They kicked off the wave of historical epics which would dominate the U.S. and Europe in the 1940s. Hitler, in fact, had their Rembrandt remade under his own aegis. The historical series included 2 films that were never completed: Lawrence of Arabia, which was shelved when T.E. Lawrence, a British intelligence agent who was the subject, died in a motor crash. This is prior to the 1960s Peter O'Toole version, I should add. But anyway, make a long story short, is this circle, the Kordas, who were recruited directly into British intelligence by Churchill and started making propaganda films in America. So, as we said, Hitchcock, the reason I point this out is because it relates, I think, directly to mass control, media psyops, and so forth through the War on Terror. And so in regard to the technique of creating what's called an atmosphere of paranoia and fear, or super reality that is imposed upon some situation through a given narrative, the author Mendocino connects this film to the Tavistock strategy of mind control. And so it becomes clear how Hitchcock's voyeurism and shock value would be useful in the realm of psyops and propaganda. Now, how would that be? Well, Hitchcock said that you would take ordinary objects, such as the birds, and you would realize Minsterberg's concept of the shock effect. Knowing what to expect, the audience waits for it to happen. And this conditions the viewer. This conditioning of the viewer, as we said before, is essential to the buildup of suspense. And that's exactly what we have in the War on Terror. Now, you had some points about the German expressionism and Satanism. Did you want to talk about that at all?
No, but you can find that in the movie Spellbound,
right,
by Hitchcock. That has a really weird scene, a dream sequence, I think, designed by Salvador Dali, and right. It was also the first U.S. movie that had satanic cult imagery in it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, Mendocino mentions that Hitchcock, his technique of filmmaking in this regard to the shock effect is identical to a Tavistock psychologist named Wilfred Bion. And Bion's techniques were developed during World War II by British intelligence to, it says Bion, who was the mentor of Wharton's school, as well as leading other social control theoreticians, determined that small groups could be manipulated if an astute leader or director, film director, could convince them of a shared reality superior to the reality that they were discussing. In other words, you have a situation, but the situation is given this heightened interpretation. And that's exactly what we have, say, in the War on Terror, or actually in any mass media psyop. Sandy Hook, right? Gun control, whatever. And Mendocino concludes by saying that Hitchcock was brought to the U.S. in 1939 by David O. Selznick to direct Rebecca with Laurence Olivier, both of whom would head the U.S. Office of, by screen adaptations by Robert Sherwood and Thornton Wilder, who were heads of the U.S. Office of War Information. So Hitchcock, right, is even when he comes to the U.S., is still working in this war propaganda circle, milieu. So he goes on to say that, as you said, the sets were designed by Dali, and Spellbound, according to the argument of Mendocino, is the first U.S. film to have satanic cult imagery, something that had not been seen since the heyday of German Expressionism, and this would be films by, say, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Well, I guess I should add too that, as I said, so Hitchcock was employed by the British Ministry to create Nazi concentration films. So he was employed to film these, as well as a couple other movies that are lesser known that were war propaganda during World War II. And as for Cary Grant in North by Northwest, his character would lead him to being considered for the role of James Bond. However, this did not happen. But North by Northwest would be tremendously influential on Broccoli and the producers of the Bond films, because you can notice all kinds of parallels between, say, From Russia with Love and North by Northwest. So in other words, North by Northwest, according to one of the Bondologists that I cite, is actually the beginning of the Bond trilogy, the Bond-esque filmmaking. Right, so it's Hitchcock who kind of begins even how Bond films would be crafted. And as we said, the consideration of Cary Grant for James Bond is interesting because Cary Grant was a spy and was involved in outing Errol Flynn as a Nazi sympathizer. So in the summer of 1932, we read, a Hollywood partnership was formed as a front for British intelligence. It was made up of Samuel Goldwyn, Douglas Fairbanks, Alexander Korda, as we mentioned, Walter Wagner, and Korda's London Films. Cary Grant worked with this partnership to flesh out Nazi sympathizers in Hollywood. And another similar partnership was organized by Cecil B. DeMille at Paramount, the famous director. Grant's chief contact with British intelligence was Noel Coward, the British intelligence agent and actor, and author of numerous plays and songs. It may be a surprise to some film buffs to learn that the major accomplishment of Cary Grant in Nazi hunting was to out Australian actor Errol Flynn. So it should be mentioned too that Jimmy Stewart was rumored to have done FBI work, according to Michael Munn in his book Jimmy Stewart: The Truth Behind the Legend. This makes his roles in Vertigo and Rear Window even more curious given the plots, because both involve surveillance. So perhaps Jimmy Stewart was actually doing surveillance. And to make it all the more obvious, Stewart played the lead role in the FBI propaganda film The FBI Story from 1959, which is given approval by J. Edgar Hoover in the trailer. While these don't really prove a whole lot per se with Hitchcock, they do show that he's running in all these circles. So it's quite obvious that I think it's, loosely at least, a British intelligence kind of operation here. And then, as I said, what we have with Cary Grant's character Roger Thornhill is that he's roped into working for this nascent agency, that's the CIA, that's run by a professor, right? So the CIA is not a bunch of James Bonds running around, it's a bunch of academics, and that's actually what the CIA is. And so he's sexually entrapped by Swallow operative Eve Kendall, played by Ava Marie Saint. And it's funny to me that when you watch a lot of documentaries on World War II or the Cold War and sex spies, you'll always see it presented like sex operatives is something that Russians would do. But the CIA, we're good guys, we don't do that. And yet here you have in both Notorious and in North by Northwest the open admission that that's what the CIA is doing, right? So this is pretty obvious that that's not something that the West is immune to, as if they're all angelic, right? It's not only the first to mention CIA, but it features a CIA sex operative. which I guess is kind of what's going on in Notorious as well. And it's also a Cold War propaganda piece because Van Damme, played by James Mason, is explicitly spoken of as working with Russians in a Cold War. So if the United Nations is an odd set piece, again, it shouldn't be, because it's the Rockefellers who, with British intelligence, set up the OSS and the CIA and the UN. And once again, we see how the worlds of Hollywood and intelligence are just mirror reflections of the same reality. And Hitchcock shows in detail that the infamous scenes involving staged news, I think, are worth mentioning as well, because they're done at the behest of the CIA. Because the CIA crafts the news stories, and as well as staging the death of Cary Grant's character. Right? And this is, again, way prior to Operation Mockingbird, which most of us know about, later exposing the CIA in the 60s and 70s as having countless hundreds of journalists on their payroll. So that's North by Northwest, and we're going to talk about The Man Who Knew Too Much for a little bit here. I think it's worth mentioning. What did you think about The Man Who Knew Too Much? Did you get any notes on that?
Not too much. I kind of liked it, but it didn't have the twist at the end that I'm kind of used to in the Hitchcock movies. It was just kind of a straightforward story about kidnapping.
I think it kind of hints at human trafficking, though, a little bit, because we're not exactly sure who's behind this plot to assassinate a prime minister, but they are under the cover of being UN spies, UN relief agents. But they're not, and they kidnap Jimmy Stewart's son and hold him for ransom, right? Because they're trying to off the president, and they hold him up in an Anglican church, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting because the Anglican church, of course, is headed up by the Queen, and the Anglican church would be quite clearly connected to Savile and all of that nastiness. So whether or not this is about necessarily human, it's not explicitly human trafficking, but they do hold him up in the Anglican church, and then they hold him up in the embassy, right?
Right.
So I don't know if that's trying to hint at something, but an interesting espionage film still worth mentioning. So next, let's talk about Vertigo.
Okay. Yeah, I liked Vertigo more than the others. It was kind of like in the top 3, I guess. And this one again has Jimmy Stewart in it, and who's hired to shadow this guy's wife, who he says is obsessed with a dead woman who committed suicide. And in this movie, Jimmy Stewart's character is also suffering from some serious post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the vertigo from when he was chasing a suspect and almost fell off a building.
Right.
So he falls in love with
traumatized again.
Yeah. He falls in love with the lady that he's supposed to be surveilling, the wife, and tries to save her again. So here's another movie about the strong male character trying to save the crazy, female.
Bitch be crazy.
And, trying to save her from her haunted obsession, just like in Marnie. So I noticed that in several of Hitchcock's movies, the leading man goes for the crazy bitch blonde instead of the more stable beta female character, and that comes up
Homely
in
midge.
The Birds. Yeah. Right. So she's got a job, she's got an income, she loves him a lot, but he's not interested in her because, she's not crazy or interesting, or it doesn't have that spark or whatever. And that's the same thing in The Birds, where he could have had the school teacher,
right,
but he would rather have the socialite,
the wild socialite.
Yeah. And so the use of spirals is prolific in this movie, even down to the lady's hairdo, and is sort of a trigger to Stewart's vertigo trauma, and making him feel uneasy, and also the audience feeling kind of. And then the spiral obviously is used in Mind Control a lot.
Yes.
Right.
Well, and I was going to add too that in my view, Vertigo is a film about the manipulation of beliefs, and so what Elster, the elite shipping magnate, does is manipulate and prey on the weaknesses and beliefs of Jimmy Stewart's character, Scotty. right? So he knows what Scotty wants in his life and what he's missing and what his weaknesses are, and he's therefore able to craft stories, a story that Scotty will believe, and he's able to use kind of subliminal triggers consistently throughout, like the spirals that you're talking about, to lead him down this path.
And at one point in the movie, the female character leads him to the top of a bell tower and like pretends to commit suicide, where he can't save her because of his condition.
Right.
And so, but this was all designed by the husband using a double, and that's a classic spy technique, right, in mind control. And who was the Stewart character fell in love with, and he was actually trying to murder his real wife using the double as the decoy. Right. And using Stewart's detective story as his alibi.
Exactly.
And then when Stewart runs into the woman again, he's still obsessed with the dead wife character. He attempts to transform this new woman, who's actually the one he fell in love with, into the one he thinks is dead, but is actually her. Right? So that was pretty disturbing, how he's trying to make over this lady, get her to dye her hair back blonde, dress her in the same exact clothes that she wore, and recreate this dead character out of nothing, but it's actually the real girl that he did fall in love with.
Exactly. I think, too, we should talk about what happens at the beginning of the film, because the first scene is a series of eyes, and it's probably the eyes of Kim Novak, and the spirals emerge from the eye, right? So this has its significance here of alerting us that we're trapped, right? So we're seeing the same spirally loss of balance, and that's what Hitchcock said about the film, is what he wanted to create in the viewer. So the swirling spiral of madness, it makes me think of that They Might Be Giants song. The spiraling shape will make you go insane. It causes us to dissociate, right? It grips us, and we lose our sense of self and identity. And so losing one's balance or falling is a metaphor for the loss of place and identity. I think this will be the crucial point in Vertigo. So how far can the manipulation of the psyche go to create and induce the loss of one's identity? And ultimately, for Scotty, he'll end up catatonic in the mental institute for a while. So in the opening scene, we see a flashback to Scotty. He's a traumatized police officer, as you said, involved in the death of a fellow officer. So while Scotty, it was not intentional, he was stuck on the ledge. He's emerged from it with vertigo, and this is the source of his trauma, kind of like Marnie was, the source of her traumas when she was young. So then he's stuck spending his days with this homely chick named Midge, and he eschews marriage. Again, this is another thing that the Hitchcock males they don't really want to be married.
Right. Jimmy Stewart didn't want to marry the Grace Kelly character in Rear Window because she was quote unquote too perfect. Right?
Exactly. Right. So then he gets a message to meet his old war buddy, Elster, and Elster has married into a great wealthy shipping family, and Elster tells this fantastic tale that his wife Madeline, as you said, is possessed by a ghost named Carlotta Valdez. So Scotty finally caves into this and agrees that he's going to spy on Madeline. So here we have Jimmy Stewart doing surveillance, which he did in real life, I suppose. But so it's interesting when they go to the Golden Gate Bridge near the Presidio, which has a dark, curious past related to mind control and pedophilia. She stares at these pillars that are supposed to be portals to the past. And so these twin pillars are constantly also shown throughout the film, as we see. So Scotty follows Madeline around town. He gets really into his voyeurism. And in the shop, he looks at her through a mirror, which is a classic symbol of the psyche and its double. So Scotty begins to fall in love with Madeline, and down deeper and deeper down the spiral we go. But I want to point out that Fritz Springmeier has an interesting connection that he makes between Hitchcock and the elite through Aristotle Onassis, somebody that I've written about before in Bond, in relation to Bond stories, with particularly Diamonds Are Forever. But the Onassis shipping magnate family connects to Grace Kelly, who was also in Rear Window. And I have an interesting point about Grace Kelly that I want to mention too, because her death is very similar to the assassination of Diana. So Fritz claims that Grace had many affairs, including an affair with Bing Crosby. Grace Kelly worked for MGM, and Hitchcock is who's credited with making her a superstar. Hitchcock, he claims, came from a generational occult family, and that Grace was in, 3 Hitchcock films: Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and I don't know what the third one is off the top of my head, but as we'll see in a bit, Hitchcock's interest in bondage and sadomasochism will come out in the film Frenzy. But what I wanted to point out here with the Onassis connection is that I'm not sure that Hitchcock had any connection to the Onassises, but according to Fritz, he did. It's interesting that the character Elster is a shipping magnate, and that's how the Onassises gained their wealth. It was through shipping and through shipping drugs. But even though Elster is not Greek, what happens is that we later learn that Scotty goes to talk to a Greek book collector, who is the best friend of the wealthy Elster, and this is all taking place very close to Bohemian Grove, as we will see with Bodega Bay. So I wonder if there isn't a kind of Bohemian Grove connection here. But in my view, I think that this is again another film that's coming out near the time of Manchurian Candidate, and we have MPD, disassociation, playing heavily into this film. But I always find it weird too that when he goes to the mental institute, that it's possible that maybe Scotty was being treated for, maybe he was a subject in MK Ultra.
Oh yeah, maybe so. Well,
because Elster is wealthy enough that he can concoct entire scenarios. He has that much power and wealth, and it reminds me of the story of the Magus, which is the exact same situation where a wealthy Greek guy is able to manipulate psychologically because he has a vast army of crisis actors at his disposal.
Right. Well, before we leave the subject of Vertigo and the spirals, that kind of made me think of True Detective at the end, where they created that big spiral in the sky. Mm-hmm. And if you look up the FBI website, they actually have the spiral is one of the things they've identified with pedophilia.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's actually in like you said, FBI stuff. Now, one argument I would make too, that if Elster is wealthy enough that he can organize all these events, couldn't he just hire a hitman? Why does he need to go to all this trouble, right? He could arrange why arrange massively intricate manipulations of subterfuges? You could just pay somebody and get away with it. But if something else is going on, if he's a mastermind in the same way that Maurice Conchis is in the Magus, then I think it starts to make a little more sense with the way Hitchcock is telling us about how the establishment views the masses and mass mind control. In other words, we the viewer are like Scotty.
That's a good point.
Well, what do you think? Why do you think Madeline dies at the end when the nun appears? Are we just supposed to debate it?
Oh yeah, that was really weird. So it was supposed to be a happy ending because he was gonna love her at the end no matter what, and then this nun comes out of nowhere and scares her to death, and she falls, right?
Yeah, I think that we're supposed to kind of view Scotty like Elster. Mm-hmm. He's become just as bad, and when you read a lot of reviews of this film, that's what they'll point out. They'll say, look, he starts out as this kind of good guy you identify with, but by the end of the film, he's become just as much a manipulator because he's jealous of what Elster did with her, that he wants to be in control. He wants to be
and he was trying to recreate her back out of nothing.
Exactly, right. So it would appear, that there is, I think, a kind of MK Ultra element to Vertigo, even though consistently throughout the film we're told that, in other words, it's not Madeline who's dissociating. It's Scotty who goes crazy and catatonic, and he has that dream sequence where he's all tripped out. It's almost like, were they giving him LSD while he was in the psychiatric
and it was like
ward?
an weird animated scene. Yeah, I remember that.
And he sees his own death.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if Scotty wasn't being dosed. So that's Vertigo. Now let's talk about Psycho.
Okay. So, yeah, Psycho. So this one and Frenzy were my favorite, and I can see why this was such a popular horror movie because it was so creepy and well made. Right. And I'd never seen it before. We were starting to study Hitchcock, so I'm glad that I got to see it, for the first time now. But,
well, before we talk about Psycho, though, we're going to do Psycho, Birds, Frenzy. We're going to go ahead and point out that this is the first half of the show, which is free to listeners. And if you like what you hear, then go ahead and go to Jay's Analysis and subscribe for $4.95 a month. You get all of my lectures and interviews and much more to come in the near future, as Esoteric Hollywood is now located at Jay's Analysis. So enjoy the show and go ahead and subscribe for the full show.